The town may be kind of small, but these folks have big smiles and big hearts, and they know what it is to have simple fun down our way, where old-fashioned singing and homey gatherings make living mighty pleasant.
Kim had such nice things to say about you, and both Rob and I really loved Kim's record, Moon Hut. And then as we dug into what you do and what you've done and are doing, there's a lot to unpack there.
You know, that was a great record to make. We were able to take a pretty long time doing it. And she's a super talent. In making that record, I was convinced that, you know, a year from when it was released, that I was going to have to be dealing with seeing her on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine.
It's never too late. Well, it is for Rolling Stone, right?
Yeah, I don't think you'd want to be on the cover of Rolling Stone these days anyway.
Hey, Troy.
Welcome to Abandoned Albums, the documentary podcast where we take a closer look at some albums that may have been forgotten about over time, and some albums you might not even know existed. I'm your host, Keith R. Higgins, and joining me once again is Rob Janicki. Hey, Rob, how are you?
Hey, Keith, how are you?
I'm good, Rob. I'm good.
At last, the film you thought you'd never have to see. The staggering story of the punk group that wrung the neck of rock and roll. No one is innocent, but some are more guilty than others. Are you part of the great rock and roll swindle?
On this episode of Abandoned Albums, we talk with producer Paul Mahern. Now, Paul may have begun his career as a teenage brat, his words, not mine, as the frontman for the seminal punk rock group Zero Boys. But he would go on to become a Grammy-nominated producer and engineer, working with artists as varied as the Judy Bats, Afghan Whigs, Iggy Pop, and John Mellencamp. But Paul isn't only a musician, producer, and engineer. He's also a music archivist and college professor. He teaches 2 classes at Indiana University, one on record production and the other called The History of Punk Rock. And I'm sure there are loads of things he does that we didn't get a chance to talk about. Paul took time out of his schedule to talk with Rob and I about Zero Boys and their debut album, Vicious Circle, about punk rock, about Indiana, and a whole bunch of other things. So here's our conversation with Paul Mahern. Thank you, Paul, for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's talk about Zero Boys.
Okay.
How did you guys come together?
So we're from Indianapolis, Indiana. I was in high school bands. I was recruited basically out of my high school band by the guys that were forming the Zero Boys. They were all, 25, 27 years old, and I was 16, 17 years old. So it was a pretty educational situation for me. They'd all been in bands, touring and doing things, and were real musicians. And then I was just like a snotty kid who thought he could be a singer. And so it was a really good combination for a punk band.
How did you, in Indianapolis, discover that type of music?
I lived in Chicago and through 8th grade, and I think that would have been 76. And so before I left Chicago to move back to Indianapolis, where my family was, you already started to see some like Ramones records sneaking out and stuff like that. So I think that gave me a little bit of an advantage. I also knew about Cream magazine. I used to go to the record store every Saturday. And so when I came back to Indy, it was my mission to like find the one record store that had a punk section and where I could buy Cream magazine. And so that really, I think Cream magazine more than anything else. In order for me, before I could drive to get to the record store that sold the punk records in Indianapolis, I had to take 2 buses. So it was like a whole Saturday affair. You'd get up, take one bus, transfer, take another bus, and you'd end up at this record store and you'd hang out as long as you could, talking to the older guys about what was cool. And that's really how I got my education in not only punk, which at the time was Nevermind the Bullocks had basically just come out. There was a couple of Ramones records out, maybe there was a Blondie record, but you'd talk to these older guys, they would be like, okay, so do you know the Stooges? Do you know the MC5? Do you know Brian Eno? And that's where, that's how I got turned on to it. And I was in a high school, 5,000 kids in this high school. I was the only punk in the high school. And at the time, I was wearing a leather jacket and had kind of a spiky haircut, and the kids would call me Fonzie because they had no idea. They had no reference, which I loved that. I mean, I loved the fact that, like, what I'm doing is so remote to these people that they think I'm being Fonzie.
That's funny.
That's how I got into it. And then, it changed the way that I hear music. But up to that point, I was really into bands like Black Sabbath and Aerosmith and, of course, the Stones and Elton John, the Beatles. But punk came along and it kind of laughed at my record collection. Like, that was kind of the appeal, that it was just like never mind the Bullocks, the first Devo record, they kind of, in some ways made the rest of my record collection obsolete for a few years because of that, because it was just so new and so interesting.
Did radio or college radio factor into your exposure at all?
No, unfortunately. In the Midwest, I don't think there was a lot of commercial radio that was playing that stuff. There was the rock radio stations. I mean, I grew up on listening to the radio, but it was all like riff rock stuff. And then kind of like really watered down progressive rock stuff. Sure. But every once in a while, like I feel like if you wanted to hear punk stuff, you had to listen to Dr. Demento, which was like every Sunday night or whatever, like a 1 hour show. And he might play like an adverts record, looking through Gary Gilmore's eyes or something like that, and then every once in a while they would have these, there was a station called WNAP and they would do like a new album show. And I think that they played the B-52s record on there once. But I mean, I was already in by that point into that stuff. There are a couple of colleges, pretty big colleges. Well, there are several in Indiana, but
sure.
Bloomington, Indiana, which is where I live now. That's where Indiana University is. Mm-hmm. And I actually teach a class at Indiana University called The History of Punk Rock.
I can relate so much to the story you just told about how you found punk rock. I was a metal guy, Sabbath, like, Iron Maiden. And then I had a friend who introduced me to, and you mentioned already, Iggy and the Stooges. And it takes what you were listening to before. And your sound, the Zero Boys is so perfectly reminiscent of like that early punk rock sound. It almost sounds like you guys came from Southern California, like that early 80s Southern California punk sound.
Well, I mean, in all honesty, we were kind of a Ramones-ish sort of band, kind of a Pistols Ramones band at first. We put out this EP called Livin in the 80s. The material's a lot slower. It's a lot, kind of standard punk. And then we heard Group Sex by the Circle Jerks. We heard Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables by the Dead Kennedys. And probably the most influential record on us at the time was Germ's GI. So you're hearing us on Vicious Circle go like, okay, well, this is what we do. We're actually an American hardcore band. Right. We're not a punk rock band. And so all the tempos went up, 30 beats per minute. And we really found something that really worked for us. But there's a lot of riffage on that record. It's definitely a pop record. I think it's a really early, some people might even consider it kind of a pop punk record. It's real thrashy and fast as well, but it's very melodic. So there's a lot of influences coming together. But yeah, that's where the SoCal influence, I mean, it is there.
The sound you just described, the bass has a huge influence on that record. It's almost the lead instrument in some songs. Welcome to I love it. But it is interesting that you guys are from the Midwest and you've got those, New York sounds, the Southern California sounds. It's really cool.
The bass player on that record is phenomenal. David Tufty Clough. I mean, he was in funk bands in Indianapolis. So he would have played in some of the same venues as like Babyface and bands like Manchild and stuff like that. He was kind of from that scene. So he's doing funk riffs at 90 million miles per hour. And that's pretty unique for a punk band, I think.
Exactly. Right.
The things there are to see in this Middle West.
A mighty big chunk of history got started right here. From rail splitter to president. But life must have been pretty rough in those days.
Yeah, I get a whale of a kick out of places like this.
How soon from formation did you go in to record the record?
So we formed, probably played like 2 or 3 shows where we were playing mostly covers. We wrote the EP during that period of time. So as soon as we had 5 songs that we could record, we went into a little 8-track studio and recorded them in a day, and then put that out ourselves. And that was the Livin in the 80s EP. And then our original bass player left. We got a new bass player. We kind of started to get faster. And then we went into this hibernation period that I just think is extremely important. And I tell young musicians this story all the time. We rehearsed every day for probably a month in our friend's garage. We had a space that we could rehearse in, and we had a 4-track recorder. We pre-recorded everything. We demoed everything every day, probably 6 to 8 hours a day. We worked on that record. And then we went into the studio. The band at this point is really probably only about 1.5 years old. And we went into the studio and we recorded that whole record in one day.
Oh.
So it's just rehearse. No editing. No, nothing. I mean, and I feel like that you can feel that. If you know that, there's a sense of urgency because we didn't have any money.
Yeah.
But we found a really nice studio and a really talented engineer who knew nothing about punk rock, but was really willing to learn what we were trying to do. And we cut the record in a day, all live except for background vocals and guitar overdubs, and mixed it the next day.
Whoa.
That's incredible.
I think even at my weathered age, I still have a perception of punk rock as something that sounds shitty. I didn't hear that I heard something crisp, clean, and there are hooks there.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the song's, a minute and a half, 2 minutes, there's a hook. And I'm like, wow, this is actually not at all what I would have anticipated.
Yeah, I mean, that's just that formula of everybody being, really well rehearsed, everybody, all the musicians being, older. They'd already, all those guys the other three guys had all made records before.
Okay.
So that had a big part of it. And then the guy who recorded it, John Helms, he was a brilliant engineer. He was like kind of like a metal-y, like a metal pop kind of guy, but he had a really nice studio. It was a 2-inch 16-track MCI console, MCI tape machine. All the microphones that you would see in 1981, no tubes, no ribbons, all condensers, and a really big room, a really big dead room. That room that we recorded in was the ceilings were probably 30 feet high, and it was probably like 50 by 70 feet. It was a ginormous room with carpet, which, as a recording engineer, anytime I'm in a space like that, I'm thrilled. I mean, this is like the Abbey Road theory, it's just sound just goes out and it doesn't come back, And then I remember being in the studio with him, John Helms, who goes on to be my mentor as a producer and as an engineer. But we're in the studio and he's like, okay, I don't really know punk rock. And we brought in a couple of records and we played him right there in the studio on a turntable, like the Germs GI record. And he caught it right away. He was like, okay, so this is, and if you have a chance to listen to Germs GI, that's a great sounding record, and you'll hear a lot of similarities, and he immediately came up with identified this thing to do with one of those early Eventide harmonizers, the H910, and so you split the guitar with that. So even though it's just one guitar, it's very stereo. And it was a great first experience. And it was really the moment when I realized, I like playing in bands and I like writing songs. I don't really like playing live, but I love this studio thing. Yeah. And I was
going to ask. Yeah.
That moment, I knew what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And I've done it since then, since I'm 50, almost 59 now. And that was when I was 17 years old. This is how I've made a living.
Wow.
Since that moment. So it was really, really good experience for me.
One of the questions I always have for musicians, especially punk musicians, I think it's a really good way to start playing music. A lot of punk is usually associated with playing live and that energy and that feel that music delivers, but you took it in a different direction. Is that where the spark came from? Not just the fact that you were, you liked being in a studio and recording music, but the specific music you were playing. Like this was a really good stepping stone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense. So one of the things that I got from punk rock, and I think is, one of the most important lessons that punk rock can give anyone, is the whole do-it-yourself ethic. And so, by the time I went into the studio to record our album, we'd already put out our first EP. We pressed them ourselves. We stuffed them in the plastic ourselves. It's just punks, especially at the time, you didn't, you'd go around to the record stores and beg them to take 3 of them on consignment. Nobody cared about you. Nobody was going to give you anything. We never demoed anything. It's just like as a punk, it was just about making something happen.
Right.
And so that attitude went with me into the studio. And I was like, okay, well, now I'm going to do-it-yourself record producer.
There you go.
And nobody could tell me any different, totally, I didn't go to school for it,
right,
and things like that. But the producer, the Zero Boys, John Helms, I came to him after we'd put out Vicious Circle, and I said, I really want to be a recording engineer, or producer, something like that. Will you take me on as an intern? And luckily for me, he said, no, I'm not going to take you on as an intern because that's just a hassle for me. It's like, then he said, but if you go out and find some bands to record, and they come in, they pay for the studio time. You sit in, I'll show you what I'm doing. And so at the time, there were a couple of compilation records coming out. I think Let 'Em Eat Jelly Beans, and then there was This Is Boston, Not L.A., and The Decline of Western Civilization, where you had these little punk scenes in the States where people were putting out compilation records based on those scenes. And I said, well, there's not really one for the Midwest, so I came up with a plan to make a record called The Master Tapes. And I got some friends from Dayton in this band Toxic Reasons, some guys from Chicago in a band called Articles of Faith, a band from Milwaukee called Die Kreuzen, a bunch of other Midwestern bands. And we would basically, book the studio on the weekend. A band would come in, we'd record them, mix it, next day, different band. And so I was never an intern. I was immediately a record producer. I was the executive producer. I released this material on my own label. I produced it. By the end of it, I was engineering it and mixing it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive.
That's, I tell young engineers all the time, I deal with a lot of them at the university, it's just like, it's all about your reel, man. It's all about what you've done. It doesn't, you got to make something. Did
you want to stay in punk? Did you just want to record everything? What were your aspirations?
I did started to burn out on punk. I think that by 84, 85, punk was kind of going in a couple of different directions, and it was becoming like more metal. It was becoming more aggressive, and so I kind of started to lose interest a little bit in that, and so I became much more interested in other kinds of music, got really interested into kind of 60s psychedelic stuff from the late 60s. And also, I had my first kid when I was 20 years old. So, once you have a child, you don't get to really just be like, oh, I only produce punk rock records. It's like,
no, I would imagine no.
At that moment, you're like, I'll record anything for money. And that's what I did. And I got involved in the kind of gospel scene in Indianapolis, which is really huge. And then just recorded R&B stuff and gospel stuff and anything that I could record. Right around that time, Mellencamp, who I was not a fan of, I didn't really think a song like Jack and Diane was giving us anything, but he released that Scarecrow record, which has got Scarecrow and a bunch of Minister Memories, I think is on that. It's a bunch of great songs. And I remember hearing that on the radio and honestly thinking, this is fucking great. This is really, really good. This is combining a lot of the elements of like kind of the 60s folky psych stuff that I'm getting into, but it's also new. It was like Americana before we really even understood what Americana was. And I think at that moment in time, I actually became a fan of his and thought, maybe someday I'll get far enough up on the ladder as a Indiana-born recording engineer that I'll be in the studio with him. And then I moved to Bloomington a few years later, and I was working on Kim's record, on the Moon Hut record, and his guitar player owned the studio that I worked at. And just one day, their engineer, who was traveling up from Nashville, couldn't make it, and they needed to do a recording. So I went into the studio, and I've probably worked on 5-6 Mellencamp records. But I think that John and I have a lot of mutual respect, and a lot of it comes from our musical taste. Mellencamp's a huge Stooges fan.
What?
Yeah.
Never would have put
huge
that together.
Stooges fan, New York Dolls, MC5. He can talk about all of that stuff. He can talk about Husker Du. He can talk about the Replacements. A lot of the stuff that I was into. And so I could play him stuff, he would play me stuff, and we had a great rapport. And I think that was a part of both of us enjoying working together. And he's a perfectionist. He's extremely tenacious, the most tenacious artist I think I've ever worked with. And so I think that is the reason that he's had a very lengthy career. Right now, probably John Mellencamp is at home writing a song.
Yeah.
And like every day.
I think the tenaciousness that you're speaking of, or tenacity that you're speaking of, comes through in his music, or at least it does to me. You can hear a song like "Warmer Place to Sleep," almost punk-like vibe to it.
Yeah. John, I don't think that John would identify himself as a punk, but he's certainly well aware of everything that came to us through punk rock. He would probably say it's just rock and roll. It's just a name that they stuck on it.
But, it is an attitude, too. It doesn't have to be a sound, necessarily. Punk is, in my opinion anyway, it's a mindset, it's an attitude, it's a work ethic.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, when we talk about music, people do label music, we label sounds because it's just easier for conversation. R&B or hip hop, you say the word and you know the kind of music you're talking about. Punk has an attitude associated with it for sure. And punk bands, the good ones, were really prolific. They wrote a lot. They played a lot. They toured a lot. He certainly did all of that in his early days. So you can almost see and feel that energy, and the sound has nothing to do with it. And it's interesting for you, Keith, because I know what a big fan of Mellencamp you are. So now you have to be more of a punk fan.
I'm okay with the ethos and around it. It's just the music itself I struggle with sometimes.
I'll get you there.
Because I teach this punk rock class, I mean, the whole thing is like, what is punk? I mean, I have to lecture like for a whole semester about like, what is punk? And then kind of describe to these kids who, if they're lucky, they have an uncle that listened to Blink 182, That's how remote they are from like what I understand to be punk rock. And so, yes, there's this attitude, the cynicism, the anarchic attitude, and things like that. Sure. And you hear that in Masters of War by Bob Dylan. I mean, it's like that's a Absolutely. Punk song. It's not a punk rock song. It's a punk song. And so there's a lot of folk songs, a lot of talking blues songs that you could say are punk songs. So you actually have to take the combination of that and then the combination of rock and roll and bring them together. And this is why, to me, the epicenter of punk rock, like 'em or not, is the Sex Pistols. Because they take this kind of glam rock thing and then they take the whole cynicism, sarcasm, chaotic attitude, and they put them together.
Where did the Clash fall in for you? Because I think there seems to be a dividing rod between the Sex Pistols and the Clash.
Yeah.
London Calling is my favorite double album ever made. That doesn't make them the epicenter of punk, though. I mean, this is a totally different thing that I'm talking about. So,
sure. Yeah,
I mean, it's like, for me, it's London Calling, Exile on Main Street, and then the White Album. Those are the three, in my humble opinion, those are the three best double albums. And, so that's heavy competition. So, yes, sure. I love the Clash. The Clash are much more politically correct. They're much more aware. They're friendlier, they're much more what I aspire to. But the Sex Pistols have a level of chaos that's like kind of unseen anywhere else. And that's why they only last for whatever, a year and a half. And Brian Eno talks about this thing called scenius. Which,
I'm sorry, say that again. Scenius?
Scenius, like
Scenius.
scene, like a scene, and genius. It's a combination. So it's like genius is talking about the individual genius. And he's much more eloquent about this than I can be. But, you know, so we have these people like Picasso and Da Vinci and Albert Einstein. And we want to concentrate on this like these were the geniuses. These are geniuses as if they operated in a vacuum. But these people don't operate in a vacuum. There's other artists, there's other mathematicians that they're working with and inspiring each other. And in the world of music, the scenius is so important, and it's so important to record making. So the Beatles, right? Obviously, you got the 4 amazing geniuses, but you also have amazing engineering staff, amazing producers, you know, and a great manager. And it's like, that's the scenius. And anywhere you go to scratch the surface, I think, with a great record, I mean, I think you'll find that there's, unless it's maybe Prince, you know, you'll find, but even with Prince, he surrounds himself with talented people. But
sure,
great records, great art are made a lot of times, most times in collaboration.
One of the aspects of genius, I think, is having the ability to pick the people around you.
Oh, yeah.
To be just as good, you know, and that's a skill.
Yeah,
you know,
that's John Mellencamp. Definitely.
I was just going to say that,
and I think that Mellencamp, he learns that from James Brown, because Mellencamp's a huge James Brown fan. I think he's like, I want to run my band like James Brown does. I'll find the best possible people, and then I'll make them work really hard.
This is the Midwest, heartland of the nation. From the Mesabi Range in Minnesota to the coal fields of Kentucky. From the steel mills of Pittsburgh to the wheat fields of Nebraska. These are the long horizons of the Midwest.
As a born and bred Midwesterner myself, do you think sometimes that the Midwest is overlooked culturally, that people just don't consider it?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're still surprised when we find out some, you know, popular band came from Ohio or Indiana, you know. It's and it seems like even more and more bands have to move, you know. So you end up, you know, you have an Axl Rose who's, you know, from Lafayette, Indiana, but he's got to go to L.A. To make something happen. But, you know, I would argue that, like, the Midwest is the best, man. I mean, it's like you got Motown, okay? Yeah. The greatest American record label of all time. You know, the greatest story, the greatest interracial story, had huge impact on civil rights, born out of a time where the country was very prosperous. So you like have 1950s Detroit. The school system, the public school system, the music programs were so strong. And that's what created that talent pool that Berry Gordy was able to use to create Motown. So you've got Motown. And then also from Detroit, you've got the Stooges and the MC5 and these bands that are just were not hugely popular at the time, but have gone on to be as influential as any band that sold millions of records at that time.
For sure.
So I think the question for me is like, why the Midwest? Why does the Midwest produce this amazing stuff? Even though a lot of people in more modern times end up having to leave the Midwest still. I think if you look at, you know, the really great records, the really great media that's made, a lot of time these people come from more remote communities as opposed to growing up in Los Angeles or growing up in New York. I think the question is why? And I think that one of the answers is because it's boring as fuck in the Midwest.
I do want to ask you about one Midwestern punk band. Rob and I have talked about these guys before. Death.
Oh, yeah.
They sort of predate the Pistols and, you know, even the Dolls to a certain extent. If I remember, my reference point is only the documentary.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, they not only do they predate those bands, but they sound like punk bands from a later era.
Yeah.
You know, like, so that I think it's more appropriate to say, well, they predate the Bad Brains, you know, which puts them 10 years ahead.
Yeah.
And when you know, with a podcast like this, you know, that particular record fits perfectly in with the title of your podcast, because that is truly, you know, a band that had to abandon what they were doing because they were just, I just don't think the world was ready, certainly not the record industry and the way they were going about it. And because they didn't, you know, maybe they didn't have the same sort of DIY kind of like energy behind them, because the punk thing had really already started, you know. I did a radio interview last year on public radio about my punk class, and the woman who was interviewing me, she said, well, you know, I was really surprised when I investigated punk for this interview that there were many more women in the punk scene than the rock scene. Why do you think that punk gave space to women? And I was like, that's not how punk rock works. You don't get space, you fucking take it. You know, and that's why there are, you know, very important, very prominent female figures in the classic punk scene. They don't dominate, but, you know, there are a lot of very important ones from the very beginning, because who was going to tell them no? You know, and like Viv Albertine, the guitarist of the Slits, you know, who's a great author, she said that she never thought that she always thought that women in rock and roll were just groupies, that they couldn't be the musicians, until she saw the Sex Pistols. Now, this is an amazing story to me. There's no women in the Sex Pistols, but it was just like that thing of like, well, fuck, anybody can do this. You know, if this is, you know, if this people are paying money to see this, I can do this. And so, you know, I have an attitude about the record industry, you know, anyway, that I've had pretty much my whole life. So if the record industry says that there's not space for you, who cares? You know, you gotta do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. I do want to ask you, I actually had to copy this really quickly. This is your project, The Archives of Traditional Music?
Oh, yeah. That's interesting.
What interests me, I'm going to quote off your wiki, your work involved all aspects of transferring analog sources to the digital realm, including everything from restoration and repair of old tapes and discs to digitization and metadata management. My question is, in today's modern recording environment, you might still record on tape. What do you do in that case if it's just a raw digital recording?
I'll try to make this as brief as possible. So yes, I worked for 2 years on an NEH-funded project at Indiana University at the Archives of Traditional Music, trying to figure out the best way to digitize old carriers. And so this was discs and cylinders and magnetic wire and tapes and, you know, like baking tapes and cleaning discs and using a microscope to measure the size of the grooves of old instantaneous discs so you could figure out which needle to use to play them, because you didn't want to play them more than you had to, you know. So it was a very interesting, very deep, very scientific project that produced this document called Sound Directions, which I'm sure has been updated since I worked on it. And then to move on to the second part of your question, yes, so Born Digital creates a whole different set of problems, but it still needs to be dealt with. So the way we make records nowadays, we're on a computer. We're punching in, we're doing edits, we're moving stuff around. It's not final until you print that final mix. Okay, so now you've got your final mix. But what about this hodgepodge of crazy bits and pieces that are being stitched together by this DAW, Pro Tools or Logic or whatever it is? What happens in 100 years when Pro Tools or Logic has moved on or they don't exist, and you want to find some, you know, some important record that was made in 2021, you want to be able to have those multi-track tapes or whatever. So I've do some archival work. I do some archival work for Mellencamp even, and, just developing, okay, so you have to go in and you have to stitch all those tracks together one at a time. Then you have to come up with a naming convention, how you're going to name the tracks, and then, all that has to tie into metadata that can be put into these, on a WAV file. There's a little bit of text that you can put in there. And, so it's a whole thing. It's a whole process. Everybody who makes a record, when they're done with it, should understand they're not done with it. Hardly anybody does this. I'm sure the major labels do. I'm sure that, Billie Eilish's records are properly archived, but most records are not. And I think that it's going to be unfortunate in 50 years or whatever when people want to revisit that stuff, and maybe those tools won't be available. Yeah, it's way more potentially tragic than a tape that's been sitting around for 80 years or 60 years or whatever it is that can be baked and then played.
Wow. Very interesting. You're like the ultimate punk in that, you did everything yourself, right? You learned, you taught yourself how to be an engineer and producer,
I'm such a fan of recorded music. And so I have looked for these opportunities throughout my career to kind of go in different directions. And this particular project was perfect for me because it was thinking about things in a completely different way. And I also got to listen to some amazing recordings, from, 100 years ago, and then realize, well, this was done with one microphone, and it's amazing, and then that really gave me a perspective on my job, because I grow up in the multi-track analog world, 16 track, 24 track, you got a bunch of microphones around the drums and stuff. And here I'm listening to this recording made in the Congo in 1952 with one microphone. And I'm like, this is better than anything I've ever done. It's like all of that stuff means very little.
Simplicity, right? Sometimes that's the key. And the question I wanted to ask you on Vicious Circle, I think there's 16 songs, right?
That probably, yeah.
And under 30 minutes.
Oh yeah.
That is a very punk rock thing. But I find it interesting, and I wonder if you do as a producer what your producer and engineer brain thinks, because of streaming and everybody's writing to an algorithm, songs are getting shorter. Mm-hmm. The choruses are coming real quick, or sometimes they're right up front. So when you produce a song, is it more fun for you to kind of tackle, a 5-minute kind of weird song with no true chorus or just a weird thing? Or do you prefer this, 2-minute and 7-second blistering song? Where does that sit with you? Which do you like better?
Yeah, that's interesting. I like both. I'm not a big fan of big, long songs unless there's something interesting going on the entire time. And that doesn't mean that there has to be a bunch of things shifting and changing. I mean, I'm a big fan of a lot of Dr. Dre's work where, it'll be a 4.5-minute song and it's one loop basically over and over again, but it's hypnotic and it really works. It's harder, I think, to keep people interested for that period of time, So, I don't know. It just depends on what kind of music it is. I'll listen to, world music stuff that's where the material's a lot longer and it just really makes sense. It just depends on the instrumentation and all that kind of stuff. I think the TikTok thing is awesome. It's where people will just take one little piece of a song, that's that maybe if you heard the song, it would just kind of go by. But then it gets on TikTok and people keep using it. And then that one little thing has a life of its own. And it's just one little snippet that's taken out of another song. This is a whole new way of people experiencing music and sonics. And as a sonic adventurer, I dig it. I'm not precious about what happens after the fact at all. You know, I've always been a big fan of sampling and manipulation, and it's not what I do because that's not my skill set. But, you know, when people do it and do it right, I'm like, wow.
Agreed. You'll get no quarrel from me on that one. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
I appreciate your time this afternoon.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye, man.
Thanks, Paul.
Take care.
Take it easy, man.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Many thanks to Paul Mahern. The songs you heard on this podcast were all taken from the Zero Boys album Vicious Circle, and they were Vicious Circle, Livin in the 80s, and She Said Goodbye. Vicious Circle is available to stream wherever you stream your favorite music. Special thanks to Ronnie Barnett and Kim Fox. Please be sure to check out the episode notes. We'll have links there for all the stuff that you're probably scratching your head about now. Abandoned Albums was recorded at Thunder Love Studios.
Produced and written by Keith R. Higgins and Rob Janicki.
Engineered and mixed by Steve Beasley. Edited by A.J. Royce.
Original music by Mike Pellegrino.
If you like what you've heard, please be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating. It really does help. Thanks for listening.
At Twitter, we are at Abandoned Albums, and on Instagram, we are at Abandoned_albums.
Many thanks to Bailey Leaf, Rob Janicki, S.W. Loudon, Michael Janicki, Steve Beasley, Mike Pellegrino, Tharina Bella, Peyton Janicki, and of course, our executive producer,
Rufus Thunderlove.
And now, until we meet again next time, I remain as always obediently yours.
Abandoned Albums is a production of Paw Print Media.